This is Mike Barrier. I'll be talking with you about Popeye the Sailor, the very first Popeye cartoon released in 1933. And you'll see here on the title card, Max Fleischer presents Popeye the Sailor by Segar. Segar was L.Z. Segar, E.C. Segar, who was the cartoonist who drew the Thimble Theater comic strip in which Popeye starred for many years. By the time this cartoon was released, Popeye was an extremely popular comic strip. He had first appeared in Thimble Theater in 1929 and very quickly caught the public's imagination, and by 1933 was a great comic strip star, so he was a natural choice for transition to the motion picture screen. And he was a natural choice for the Fleischers because if you look at Popeye in the comic strip or on the screen, he's a pretty eccentric-looking character and eccentric behaving, too. He's a very likable, very gallant, very chivalrous, but also a true character. And his eccentricity made him a natural fit for the Fleischers in a way he would not have been, say, in the cartoons of any other studios. And a little later in this cartoon, we got a strong sense of how eccentric the Fleischer cartoons were in the early 30s. This was sort of a golden age for the Fleischers. Their cartoons were so distinctive and so different from anybody else's, certainly extremely different from the Disney cartoons. And it's tempting to speculate how animation might have evolved if the Fleischers had been able to continue in that same vein over the course of the next few decades instead of gradually surrendering their distinctiveness over the next few years.
That's your one lightsaber with Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eats my spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
Popeye's voice here is provided by a vaudeville singer and actor named William Costello, who performed as Red Pepper Sam. This type of voice, this kind of frog voice, you can hear it in very early recordings. For example, there's a record called King of the Bungaloos by a performer named Gene Green, and he slips into a very similar voice at one point. Costello did the voice for a few years and then was succeeded by Jack Mercer, who's the Popeye voice we all really know. Something you're going to notice here is that the supporting characters in this cartoon, except for Olive Oyl and Bluto, are animals, and this again is very typical of the early years of the Fleischer cartoons.
I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
And here's the eccentricity talking about. Look at how the characters are jumping from the tunnel of love onto the Ferris wheel, from the Ferris wheel onto the roller coaster. The merry-go-round rises in the air and has to be pulled back down. This is a sort of ingenious, curious thing that you would not see in other people's cartoons. There's a sort of musical twitching here that all the characters, there's a constant sense they're moving in time with the music, and this was something that Dave Fleischer wanted. It was their way of trying to achieve something like the same sense of synchronization that was present in the Disney cartoons and other cartoons made on the West Coast. It has kind of a different effect here. The music and the action weren't tied that closely together. This was a rather rough and ready way of suggesting synchronization that wasn't actually that close, and so it has kind of an odd effect. The other thing that's very distinctive here, and you've noticed that, for example, when they were coming off the boat and there were all these little gags with the sailors, something Dave Fleischer wanted, something he gave the cartoons their distinctive character, was he wanted a gag in every scene, some kind of bit of comic business. And this, again, was not something you'd find in other studios' cartoons. And a lot of times there wasn't any real gag. A scene had another role to play. We're going to hear from Dave Tendler about that in a minute, but first of all, before we do that, let me just mention Betty Boop. Now, this is technically a Betty Boop cartoon. The Fleischers, when they signed their contract with King Features Syndicate in 1932, provided for a test cartoon, and this is, in fact, that test cartoon in the Betty Boop series. Betty was very popular in the early 30s. The animation you're seeing of Betty here is actually picked up from a cartoon called Bamboo Isle, and it is, in fact, rotoscope of a performer in the group called the Royal Samoans. The rotoscope was a tracing of live action that Max Fleischer actually patented back in the teens, and they used quite extensively. But I was talking about the little gags in the different scenes. There may not actually have been a gag written in the scene, but so the animator's job was to come up and find some way to put a gag in it. some little bit of business that would pass as a gag. And we're going to hear now from Dave Tendler. He'll talk about how that exactly worked. Dave Tendler was one of the principal animators at the Fleischer Studios, animator and animation director in the 30s.
Dave Fleischer's theory, you might say, was that every scene should have a gag. Nobody should animate a scene without a gag. You know, he would come around every other day, perhaps, and speak to the guy, visit, and he'd pick up your scene and he'd flip it, and he said, well, where's the gag in this, And if there's not a gag, well, gee, God help you, So, and if you think of something, particularly in a scene, you would confer with him, or vice versa, and you would come up with something in the scene for what they consider the gag, whether it was a chair moving across the room, or whether it was an apple sitting on the table, an apple in a bowl of fruit would animate up and say something and go back in the bowl. This was a gag. This is what they considered a gag. Something had a little surprising piece of business had to happen in the scene.
Bluto deserves a mention here. Bluto was used actually in only one story in Segar's version of Popeye in the 30s. It was in the summer of 1932, and he was in a story called The Eighth Sea, and he had a 2-week fight with Popeye. If you can imagine that in a comic strip, 2 weeks of nothing but two characters beating up on each other. This made him a very attractive candidate for the Fleischers to put against Popeye.
I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.